Bitcoin mining and how a nation state or a national utility would go about in mining Bitcoin. Now, first, a few facts about electricity generation in South Africa. So Eskom generates about 45,000 megawatts with coal, so excluding all the other ways in which they are generating electricity. And the way that coal works is you burn it, you warm up water, which becomes steam. The steam goes through a turbine, and it looks like this, these huge things. And then the turbine turns a generator, and you get electricity out on the other side. Now, these are very, very large machines. I used to work on a power station called the Tabu Power Station in the Vaal, and we burn 1 ton of coal every second. So it's about a bucky load every second. 365 days, 24 hours a day, since the 1980s. And Eskom has 15 of these power stations. All right, so you can do the numbers and just try to fathom how massive that is. All right, so starting a boiler and one of these turbines costs you about 1.5 million rand, just starting it up. It's like, you know, starting up your car. Imagine that would cost you 1.5 million rand. So they are always running, and their speed, the low speed at which they can run is about 50%. So imagine you have a car, your max speed is 100 kilometers an hour, but your lowest speed is 50. Like anything below that, your car stalls and you have to shut it down. So ideally, you know, you can only operate these machines between 50 and 100%. And the electricity is never dumped. Like, that's a misconception. Electricity cannot be dumped. Your supply and your demand must always match each other. So the amount of electricity you generate and the amount of electricity that we all use in our houses and in our offices and on the mines, they must always match each other 100%. Now, what if the supply is too low? So Eskom cannot supply enough to meet the demand. Well, then something happens that we're very familiar with. It's load shedding, right? But what if the demand cannot match the supply? Well, then the generators are throttled. But like I mentioned, they can only be throttled between up to 50%, right? And not anything lower than that. But that's not a problem because Eskom controls all of the supply, all of the coal power stations. But here's the issue now. IPPs, independent power producers, coming online, connecting to the national grid. Eskom has no control over it. In fact, Eskom is engaged in long-term supply contracts with those IPPs. So they have to take the power, regardless. And they have to make a plan with the coal-fired power generators if there's too much power, right? And this is, the sun and the wind, they don't always shine, they don't always blow, so it's actually a huge, huge problem for Eskom. Eskom also has something that's called the reserve margin, which is about 2,000 megawatts, which I always have, even during load shedding. Why? Because if one of these large turbines trip and they go off suddenly, that's 600 megawatts off the grid, and they have to very, very urgently make that up. Like I said, it must always be balanced. Now, they obviously cannot load shed within seconds, and they need to react within seconds. So that's not an option, really, if something like that happens. So they go into the reserve margin, and if the reserve margin cannot actually be maintained, then they will trip a mine or a steel plant or something like that. One of these large, intensive electricity users in order to match supply and demand again. And Eskom has contracts with these guys in which they would then pay for the loss in manufacturing or production when these things happen. All right, that's it for the boring part. Let me move on. So now, imagine you could take the Bitcoin network and you can put it on this demand side, right? And it becomes a client that just feeds, that just takes electricity. So ignore everything about the Bitcoin network and cryptography and all of the theory behind that and the security and the keys. Just think of the Bitcoin network as a client. It's a black box. It charges electricity as much as you want to give it. And on the other side, you get about 2 Rand a kilowatt hour. All right? The wonderful thing is that this Bitcoin network pays you in real time. So it uses the electricity in the morning, and you have the money in your bank account tonight. Much better than a municipality, right? A municipality which has a credit agreement, and Eskom sitting with now 92 billion rands of debt from municipalities. It's an easy customer. It takes the power when you have it. It doesn't take it when you don't have it. You know, there's no contracts. And then the big thing is it stabilizes the grid. And what I mean by that is you can throttle it instantaneously in very, very, very small steps, very small margins. You can go up or down this Bitcoin mining farm. So it acts like an anchor. Now, we do have, like I mentioned, some customers of Eskom that plays this role. of being able to be tripped or throttled, and that is a steel plant, for example. But the thing about a steel plant is Eskom shuts them down, and it takes 3 days for them to start up. And Eskom needs to cover that production losses for 3 days, all right? Or a data center, but a data center you don't really want to shut down. Data center can also play the same role to a certain extent, but there's no granularity. You cannot really like throttle them in small little steps. You have to shut it down entirely, and it doesn't like it. Like a data center, really, you can imagine training an AI model doesn't want to be shut down. Whereas a Bitcoin miner, it doesn't care. It can be shut down, it can be throttled, it can be overclocked, it can be underclocked. You can shut down one machine, or you can shut down a section of them. It's not location dependent. You need a small little satellite for a warehouse as big as this one here, full of mining machines. It is just the absolutely perfect customer of a national electricity utility. All right, so in 2018, I wrote a blog article making a case for why Eskom should mine Bitcoin. It's still online, you can go and read it. That was 7 years ago. Now, I ran a little bit of a simulation for the last 5 years. So since 2020, because that's how far I could get the data. I couldn't get the data from 2018. So I ran a little bit of a simulation to see where Eskom and South Africa would have been if we mined Bitcoin for the last 5 years. So I think this will, the numbers are quite amazing. It's fascinating. All right, so starting in April 2020, mining up until the end of last year with S19 Pros, and a power plant size of 2,000 megawatts. Now, how did I get to 2,000 megawatts? Well, I took all of the data that I can find from Eskom for the last 5 years, hourly data, so very, very high frequency, and looked at how much surplus power they had in the last 5 years. Coal-fired power, not talking expensive power like gas turbines, hydro, those kind of things. Imports, we import power from Mozambique as well. Only the coal-fired power stations, which is very, very, very cheap power, by the way. It's almost free. So then, 2,000 megawatts from that, not mining during load shedding, of course, and not mining when the gas turbines are running. If we did that, then we would have mined for about 75% of the time for the last 5 years. Okay? And I ran the numbers, and it basically, it would have cost Eskom $1.7 billion to build the plant in 2020. They would have paid that money back in 279 days, so beginning January 2021, with a miner availability, as I said, about 72%. They would have mined 406,000 Bitcoin to date, all right? Now, if they were to sell that in real time, because remember in 2020, I think the price was $6,000 to $10,000, those ranges. So if they were to sell that in real time, they would have netted $12.1 billion. Now, if Eskom decided to only sell 50% of it, now you can do a lot of these like simulations, but if Eskom were to sell 50% of it and hodl the rest, they would have basically netted around $6 billion in the last 5 years, and they would have had about 400 billion rand in capital right now, which is equal to Eskom's total debt currently. So they would have been debt-free. And there's a lot of things that you can do with these numbers and this model, and you can play around. Like last year, or if they speculated slightly and they didn't sell on the spot, they sold maybe, or they did the arbitrage, or whatever the case may be, then of course it would have been a lot more. And I'm not an economist, but I'm sure there are many of you here that are economists that can also determine on what growth path South Africa would have been if Eskom was in a sound financial position with zero debt, with an additional 6 billion generated over the last 5 years. And I'm sure, well, I can just estimate that South Africa would have been on a double-digit growth path, 10% plus at this point. So yeah, I mean, the best time to have started mining was obviously in 2020, but I think the second best time is now.